This is Akashvani. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring you a discussion on significance of Prime Minister's visit to the US and strengthening India-US relations. The participants are Bhaswati Mukherjee, former diplomat, and Dr. Harsh V. Pant, strategic analyst. Moderator is Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing the visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the United States of America. The Prime Minister will pay an official visit to the USA at the invitation of US President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden. The visit will commence in New York, where the Prime Minister will lead the celebrations of the International Day of Yoga at the United Nations headquarters on June 21st, and then the Prime Minister will travel to Washington, D.C. for his other engagements. Ambassador Mukherjee, when you look at this visit also in the backdrop of deepening, strengthening India-US relations and the fact that this is a state visit, how significant is this for the India-US bilateral relationship?
It is highly significant, keeping in mind, in fact, President Joe Biden's casual remarks when he met our Prime Minister some time back for the G7 meeting, and he said that he was unable to invite all the guests who wanted to join the state dinner which is being hosted for him. This just goes to show the warm relationship between President Joe Biden and our Prime Minister, the strength of the connection, the importance of our diaspora in the United States, and the fact that the United States considers India to be a reliable strategic partner in this region and in the Indo-Pacific, and as a very powerful country that can help to counter China's rise, act as a balancing force, and prevent deterioration of peace and security in the region, be it the Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea. And I'm sure that the fact that there is bipartisan support for recognition of the McMahon line in the United States has also given a fillip to the relationship, because this was much required, and it shows that the whole of the United States stands behind India in its efforts to stare down the Chinese who are trying to change by salami slicing the line of actual control. So I think all in all, it's a very, very significant visit. And I'd like to add that the International Day of Yoga is also very important. This was again started under Prime Minister Modi's initiative in his first term. It has become immensely popular and it has spread all over the world. So you even have countries like Saudi Arabia, etc., who have yoga schools and who are practicing yoga. This is again India's soft reach, which our Prime Minister has been so successful in doing globally.
Dr. Pant, taking on what Ambassador Mukherjee said, and I wanted to talk a little more about China. We've also seen that, when it comes to not just the India-US bilateral relationship, but also generally when we are talking about global politics today, the China factor has become very important, very significant, and I would say very worrisome also. How do you see the China factor playing in during the Prime Minister's visit to the US? How do you see both India and the US together then countering this China factor?
This what we are witnessing and what we are looking at today as the changing global at the level of the global order is growing concern about China's aggression, China's assertiveness, and also a realization in the West in particular that perhaps the approach that they have had so far vis-a-vis China has not really worked. And therefore, there is a recalibration going on and there is a reassessment going on about what to do about China, how do you manage China's rise. Something that I think, in all fairness, India has been one of the first countries to articulate that this is going to be a problem long before anyone else in the West was talking about. I think China factor would be very potent and will continue to be a potent variable in the way India and the US reconfigure their relationship, and it will be at the backdrop, I think, of Mr. Modi's visit. Of course, the visit is going to be about many more things and about a positive trajectory, as Ambassador Mukherjee was articulating, that US and India have charted bilaterally and, of course, globally. But China and the concern about China will continue to animate those conversations and will continue to accelerate perhaps the process of this kind of this rapprochement that we are seeing between India and the US suddenly taking off in ways that we had not anticipated just a few years back. When Mr. Modi had come to power, there were several questions about American commitment to India. We have seen 3 presidents changing over the last 9 years. And what has been interesting is that despite changing governments, a certain commitment to India that has been front and center, and perhaps China has been an important variable there. We have seen in the last year itself, last year and a half, how despite the seeming divergences over Ukraine, our commitment towards each other has only increased, India and US. And I think that's again a significant indicator that while Russia, and we may have differences over how we engage with Russia, both US and India, the reality that confronts both these nations against the backdrop of a rising China is something that they are worried about. Indo-Pacific, if it is the center of gravity of global politics and global economics today, then that's where the interests of America and India converge. India needs America and America needs India to manage a stable balance of power. And I think that's the reality, that strategic reality that confronts these two nations. And against that backdrop, we will see a lot happening both during this visit and beyond.
We also see that the Prime Minister will travel to Washington, D.C. after being in New York on June 21st. In Washington, D.C., he will first receive a ceremonial welcome at the White House, and he'll meet President Biden, where they will continue their high-level dialogue. The U.S. President and the First Lady will then host a state dinner in honor of the Prime Minister the same evening. Ambassador Mukherjee, how important is the fact that this is a state visit, and also the fact that the Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister, he will also be addressing the joint sitting of the U.S. Congress on June 22nd?
It is highly significant. If I'm not mistaken, I think this is the second time he would be doing it. The ceremonial welcome is unprecedented. The hosting of the state dinner by the First Lady and the President, and the addressing of the joint sitting of both houses, all these three elements demonstrate that the US-India relationship has come of age. It's a mature partnership. Both sides have trust and confidence in each other. And as my colleague Dr. Pant rightly pointed out, we have been able to very successfully skirt around the disagreements with regard to the Ukraine-Russia conflict in the greater interest of the bilateral relationship and the recognition by United States that on many of the aspects of the Ukraine-Russia issue, there was very little option for India to maneuver, but still we did our best, keeping in mind the fact that we did not want these disagreements to in any way impact the strength of the bilateral partnership between India and United States. I do believe that the address to the joint sitting is also a strong commitment by President Joe Biden to the fact that the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy is addressing the joint sitting of the world's oldest democracy. Questions could have been raised in the past about the strength of our democracy, but the fact that our Prime Minister is in Washington, will be in Washington and addressing the joint sitting of both houses demonstrates a strong American commitment to the strength of our democracy, to the strength of the ties, and to the fact that United States stands committed with India to upholding the global world order and international peace and security, which both sides believe could be threatened by an aggressive, overambitious China.
Dr. Pant, I wanted to bring in a little discussion about the Quad. And we've seen that India, US, Japan, Australia forming the Quad. How significant do you feel is the fact that both India and the US are together, working together in the Quad today? How is it adding strength to then this bilateral relationship? How does one build into the other?
Simran, this has been one of the most interesting developments in this relationship, that the relationship today, the bilateral relationship between US and India is getting embedded into a wider network of these minilaterals that are emerging in the world. And one of the most important and interesting ones is this quadrilateral security dialogue among India, Japan, Australia, and the US. And of course, we should remember that there is another quad in the Middle East, which involves US, India, Israel, and UAE. We have had our national security advisors recently meeting, 4 national security advisors recently meeting in the Middle East as well, India, US, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So in a way, the relationship, which largely had been bilateral, today is increasingly becoming global in nature through these minilaterals. And the Quad in particular, the Indo-Pacific Quad in particular, is a very interesting development because it underscores two things. It underscores a commitment by like-minded countries to come together and work together to solve regional problems, to provide solutions to regional issues that had become in the past dominated by one power. China was the only country that seemingly loomed large. Now with Quad, we have an alternative vision is being presented, whether it is related to infrastructure, whether it is related to maritime security or vaccine development, all kinds of issues post-COVID we have seen being part of the Quad agenda and taken up by these four actors at a regional level to scale up a number of activities that these four countries were engaged bilaterally with each other in the past. In that sense, a very interesting development. It is also an interesting development in another context, that there is a commitment by America and other countries like Japan and Australia to build a platform which is quite unique, because Japan and Australia are alliance partners of the US, whereas India is not. So despite that, you have four countries, three of whom are in some ways are alliance partners of each other, but one is not. Despite that, they are together. There is a commitment to rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. There is a commitment to certain fundamental principles and norms in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the direction of Quad is very positive. It is not overtly against China. But what it is saying is that if countries want to work together in this region, they need to have a similar frame of reference. They need to agree on certain principles if the rules-based order is to be protected and preserved in a region that is dominating the global discourse. So I think as Quad has become potent, as America and India and Japan and Australia continue to invest in Quad, we will see Quad emerging as a central node in a larger security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, where at the moment there is a paucity of institutions. So I think we are looking at something very innovative, something very interesting, and a platform which perhaps can lay the foundations of the way Indo-Pacific and the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific is likely to evolve. So very important development. And also remember that in 2007, it was when the first, when Quad was talked of for the first time, it did not succeed. But by 2017, it was back in action. And suddenly in the last 2 years, post-COVID 3 years, we have seen a lot of activity, partly because of how negative China's approach has been in the region. So I think all in all, a very, very important and interesting development. And the fact that India is engaged in Quad, the fact that India is engaged with the US in Quad, gives India-US relationship a completely new dimension, something that was missing in the past.
Ambassador Mukherjee, if we discuss a little about the Ukraine conflict and how India has stood its ground when it comes to its relationship with Russia. And today, India also shares this great relationship with the United States, where one sees a great strengthening of ties. Do you feel that despite the Ukraine conflict and India's own interests, India has managed this real fine diplomatic balancing of maintaining its relationships with Russia and with the United States?
Foreign policy is based on core national security interests for any country. But I must insist that although we've never agreed with unilateral sanctions imposed without the approval of the United Nations, we have not violated these sanctions in any way. We have found ways to get around them so that our economy does not suffer, so that our post-pandemic recovery is not affected. But we have done it in a manner that is totally legal, in accordance with the directives of those very sanctions themselves, be it oil or gas or anything else. Moreover, we have repeatedly said, our Prime Minister has repeatedly said, quite apart from that this is not the era of war, we have repeatedly said that we would like an end to the conflict, that this is a conflict that is not benefiting anyone, neither the two parties concerned nor the international community, and that we would very much welcome a return to peace and security in the region. In fact, some of the innovative measures that we have taken have helped to balance out our economic growth and has been acknowledged privately and otherwise by Western countries as an innovative way to ensure even that their own gas supplies are not affected. Because, for instance, if you would recall that there was the response by our External Affairs Minister when it was suggested that perhaps are we completely following what has been written in the sanctions. He explained that what we are doing is actually fully in conformity with the EU's own regulations on the matter, which does not lay any restriction on such products being refined in our refineries and then sold to countries. It's not a violation of the sanction. So in every way, we have been able to innovate, to find a way out, to do a balancing act, which for the moment has borne a fruit. But of course, we would much prefer an end to the conflict and the gradual withdrawal of sanctions, because these sanctions in an era of globalization is hurting everybody, including those countries that impose them in the first instance.
Dr. Pant, if you could talk a little about the defense relationship between India and the United States. And we have seen that the defense cooperation is one sector which has seen a lot of activity, and it is also expected that during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, D.C., we are likely to hear the announcement of a drone deal. For our listeners, can you explain a little about how this defense cooperation is also becoming one of the centers of this bilateral relationship?
Two aspects of India-US bilateral relationship are in the driving seat at the moment. We have the technology cooperation, high-end technology cooperation, and related to that, but also stands on its own feet, is the defense cooperation. And for a long time, this argument has been made that India and the US should be integrating themselves much more at the level of defense, and gradually but surely a process of diversification that India started in early 1990s has come to fruition, where we have multiple defense partners today, where we are not putting all our eggs in one basket, because over-dependence on any one country, especially on defense, makes a country very vulnerable, as we are experiencing, I think, today, what is happening in Ukraine. So I think what with the US, as we have seen, US has an extremely sophisticated defense establishment. Both public sector and private sector in the US work in tandem, and they have created a defense machinery that is quite sophisticated and effective and very, very potent. And India, in certain ways, would like to partake of the successes that the US has achieved in the defense sector, as India transforms its own military, its own defense, to emerge as a key player in the 21st century, how India fights wars, how India will conduct its future campaigns. All of that is reliant on high-end defense technology. And on that, we have seen gradual convergence emerging. In the past, there were differences about the technology transfer. India wanted the relationship to move beyond a buyer-seller relationship into one of co-production and co-development. India, in recent years, has talked of Make in India. Self-reliance has been the mantra we are trying to follow. We are trying to create a defense manufacturing base in this country, where India also becomes eventually an exporter of defense equipments. And we have seen an extraordinary degree of success in that in recent years, with our exports jumping quantums. So I think in some ways, partnership with the US allows us to do that. And the US has now recognized that the old paradigm, where they were worried about intellectual property, where the private companies worried about aspects of Indian rules that they thought would subvert their growth, those do not apply any longer, and that India itself today is quite capable of standing up to pressures from a country like China. And that means that they invest in India's defense capabilities, and the more likely it is that India will be able to stand up to the Chinese behemoth, the more likely that India will be a capable provider of global security, to become a provider of net security provider in the region, and that helps America. So all in all, in the last few months itself, we have seen a lot of activity on this front. In January this year, we saw initiative on critical and emerging technologies being signed. And now we have seen last week, during Secretary of Defense's visit, Austin Lloyd's visit to India, a roadmap on defense cooperation was signed, which lays out a framework for co-production and co-development between US and India. And I think all of that means that as India moves forward, and as you point out during Prime Minister's visit, as India signs a lot of agreements of cutting-edge technology, we are looking at a relationship that is going to be redefined by this aspect. And we are also going to look at how the two nations can work even more closely, because we are already doing the largest number of our military exercises with America today. So in a sense, the level of comfort has grown. There is a strategic symmetry, there is a strategic convergence, which both sides are keen on exploiting, and defense and technology are going to be the two drivers that perhaps will drive the relationship both in the strategic sense as well as in the economic sense.
Ambassador Mukherjee, we see that on June 23rd, the Prime Minister will be jointly hosted at a luncheon by US Vice President Kamala Harris and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. In addition to his other official engagements, Prime Minister Modi will have several interactions with leading CEOs, professionals and other stakeholders. He will also meet members of the Indian diaspora. I wanted to talk a little about the presence of the Indian diaspora in the US and how their presence and how their efforts have also contributed in themselves at strengthening this relationship. How do you see the contribution of the Indian diaspora?
The Indian diaspora has played a seminal role, in fact, in moving the relationship forward, because today the Indian diaspora is occupying positions of importance, be it politically or economically, and they are actually in a position to influence decisions across the bipartisan divide of the United States, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. The Indian diaspora earlier also and this time too are organizing a huge reception to welcome Prime Minister Modi. This is particularly welcome because of efforts by certain elements to give a negative narrative about certain issues here in India, which is not correct, whether it's the state of the democracy or treatment of minorities, and the fact that the majority Indian diaspora has rejected this negative narrative and are giving this fabulous reception for our Prime Minister on the 23rd of June, will also help to reassure those who are away from India that all is well and that the Indian democracy is thriving under Prime Minister Modi, as is the India-US relationship. I might like to add that the meeting with CEOs is also very important because some of the CEOs are of Indian origin, which also demonstrates that once again, India has been able to seamlessly get absorbed into American society, American economy, American politics. That is actually the strength of India, that Indians who become diaspora in other countries are seamlessly absorbed but never forget their culture. So they are ambassadors for India in the country of adoption, but they also strengthen the country that they have adopted. So on both sides, it's a win-win situation. And that is actually the strength of the Indian culture and civilization. We do not threaten, we do not commit aggression, we bring our culture and civilization, we absorb the other culture and civilization, and we strengthen both sides, the link to Mother India and the adopted country.
Dr. Pant, talking a little about the soft power, and we see that the Prime Minister's visit will first start in New York, where he will lead the celebrations of the International Day of Yoga at the UN headquarters on June 21st. How do you see that in the recent past? Of course, we've all watched Hollywood movies and we have all been recipients of the soft power which comes from the US. Do you feel that now we also see this mutual travel of soft power? We have a lot of Indian cultural things which people in the US and the world generally are understanding. One example is, of course, yoga. But there are other Indian cultural aspects which are now getting explored and understood much better. And that also helps India emerge and take its rightful place as a global power today.
I think in particular, one has to give credit to Prime Minister Modi's leadership because he has been able to convey a sense of India to the world that is self-assured, that is rooted in its civilization heritage, and yet willing to engage with the world on its own terms. And that means that when you have, Ambassador Mukherjee talked about India's diaspora, which is also a part of India's soft power, which is also a manifestation of India's soft power. The fact that Indians in America have done so well economically, politically, I think all that builds into that sense of confidence that I think the external world feels about India, that India is a country that has a long tradition of exporting ideas to the world, of bringing new ideas to the world, of shaping the way the world evolves in multiple dimensions, be it economic, political, diplomatic, etc. In recent past, what we have seen, how small things like yoga, or with the focus on Indian culture, and the way when Indian Prime Minister goes out, the way he showcases Indian diversity, Indian culture, Indian craftsmanship to global leaders, that demonstrates that India in some ways is a unique combination of contemporary and ancient, that our ancient values, our civilizational values continue to inhabit the way we look at the world and the way we engage with the world. So in that sense, I think there has been a great transformation in the way the world has looked at India, and the world is also looking at India as a country that can increasingly govern itself well, that can increasingly deliver, that can increasingly provide solutions to global problems, and that too from a civilizational point of view, rooted in its own ethos. And I think that makes all the difference, because when the world looks at India today, they look at it through a very different set of eyes. They look at a very comfortable India in its own skin. They look at a leadership in India that is willing to be that bridge between two different worlds, and they look at a leadership that is also delivering at home at the same time, reaching out to the world in different times of crises, and then like say during the COVID catastrophe. All of that, if you combine it together, if you look at the success of our diaspora abroad, all of that builds this image of a country that has enormous cachet of power, and that power may not be coming out through the barrel of a gun, but that power comes out through its ideas, through its people, through its culture, and through the manifestations of that culture. And I think that's what is bringing India today so much closer to the rest of the world in ways that perhaps the rest of the world had not seen India in the past. And that, I think, is a very significant change, both in terms of the value that India puts in its soft power and the value that the rest of the world puts in India's soft power.
Ambassador Mukherjee, as we wrap up the discussion, if you were to pick up three focus areas in going, say, just a few years ahead, a short roadmap for the future, if you would call it, what are those three focus areas that you think India and the US need to work on together so that this relationship, which we find growing in strength, will grow even stronger in the coming future?
Well, I would say straight away, the defense and technology aspects of the relationship are very important. Joint global leadership at a time when the international order is facing a challenge from a country that sees itself emerging as a superpower to challenge the other superpowers. So global leadership is much required, and India and United States can do a lot. And the democratic and civilizational connect through our diasporas is again unique to the India-US relationship. One has to go to United States and meet the diaspora to understand how enthusiastic they are about the new India that is emerging under Prime Minister Modi, the confidence they have in India, and that is what is required to ensure there is a steady and increased flow of investments and FDI into India as we seek to bring in modern infrastructure, as we seek to have a modern defense industry, indigenous, as we try to ensure that the infrastructure next to the line of control is up to the level required to face down the Chinese in case of a conflict, etc. All these are issues that join us together. So I would say, therefore, defense and technology right at the top, global leadership, and democracy and the civilizational connect through the diaspora, the Indian diaspora in the United States, which acts actually as not only as a bridge, but as India's ambassadors on a 24/7 basis in the United States of America.
Dr. Pant, your concluding remarks, please.
I think I would echo a lot of what Ambassador Mukherjee has said, and also would just underscore that I think, when the world looks at India today, if they look at a democracy, a multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy, that for all its challenges is actually doing relatively well. We have come out of COVID much better than any had anticipated, and we are the fastest growing major economy in the world today. And I think we are able also to stand, to countries like China on our own terms. We are standing up to China along the border, but we are also making a point that if need be, we can stand on our own. So I think, those issues, when you look at that and when you look at our partnership with the US, it has grown because there is a greater confidence in the US that India is not only standing up for its own interests, but also now increasingly shaping the global order. And that, I think, is going to be constant refrain that you will hear next week when Prime Minister Modi goes there, because I think that's the weight of that appreciation is one of the main factors behind the kind of celebration, the kind of acknowledgement of India that you will see next week emerging in Washington and beyond.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on the India-US relationship, and we will follow Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, D.C. and New York. With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on significance of Prime Minister's visit to the US and strengthening India-US relations. The participants were Bhaswati Mukherjee, former diplomat, and Dr. Harshvi Pant, strategic analyst. The moderator was Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official.